Good evening. I'm Dr. David Downing.
And I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and we are the newly appointed co-directors of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College.
And it is our honor and delight to present the inaugural event of the Muriel Fuller Endowment for the Imagination and the Arts, made possible by the Esmond Nissim Foundation. And we have Muriel Fuller's nephew here tonight. He was the one who was able to arrange for this endowment. So we're very happy to have you here with us. We are collaborating with the Billy Graham Center in this presentation, and there will be another one tomorrow in the Baki Auditorium in the Wade Center. You remember the scene in the Old Testament in 2 Kings where Elisha and his servant wake up to find they're surrounded by the king of Syria and his army. And Elisha is rather relaxed about the situation, but his servant is terrified. And he says, be calm. Those that are with us are much more than those that are against us. And he prays that the Lord will open his servant's eyes, and suddenly the servant sees angels and horses and chariots of fire all around them, and he realizes that they are indeed in a safe place, even when surrounded by armies. We do not have too many prophets with us these days who can literally open someone's eyes to the spiritual dimension. So we look to our artists to do that for us and talk about spiritual awakening, spiritual opening of eyes. So tonight's program will focus upon ways in which artists can help us open our eyes to the spiritual dimension.
And I am going to introduce the speakers, the conversationalists for tonight. First of all, we have Dr. Malcolm Guite, who teaches in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, where he also serves as Chaplain of Girton College. His many talents are especially appropriate for this inaugural event of the Muriel Fuller Endowment, because not only has he published books on Christian faith and theology, but he has 5 books of poetry, and he is a singer and songwriter for a rhythm and blues rock group in Cambridge called Mystery Train. And I think we're going to be able to hear some of his singing tonight. When Dr. Guite was a featured artist at the University of North Carolina, the organizers introduced him by asking this question, and it's so good, I just have to read it to you. What would happen if John Donne or George Herbert journeyed to Middle Earth by way of San Francisco, took musical cues from Jerry Garcia, fashion tips from Bilbo Baggins, and rode back on a Harley? The answer is Dr. Malcolm Guite. If Dr. Guite drives a Harley, Dr. Michael Ward, who is joining us tonight, pilots a spaceship, boldly going where no one has gone before. In 2007, his award-winning book, PLANET NARNIA, broke sound barriers, made sonic booms as it blasted into the stratosphere of Lewis studies. We are privileged at the Wade Center to have him as an advisory editor for 7, which is the journal produced by the Wade Center. And he is currently a senior research fellow at Oxford University's Blackfriars Hall, a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University, and an ordained Catholic priest. And Dr. Ward is largely responsible for getting a memorial stone placed in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey for C.S. Lewis. That's big. Now, the taproot for this evening is Dr. Root, Dr. Jerry Root. He is Professor of Evangelism and Director of the Evangelism Initiative here at the Billy Graham Center. And he's published numerous works on Lewis, has spoken all over the world. He's been teaching about C.S. Lewis for 40 years. So he is going to be coordinating the conversation, and I want you to welcome them all up to the stage now.
So the way Professor Downing introduced us, I want you to know you'll be spending an evening with Ransom and Gimli. We're going to talk about the arts. We're going to talk about the imagination. We'll have a strong C.S. Lewis thread in there, and we're eventually going to move towards a particular end that I find very interesting and I think will be helpful to you as well, related to evangelism and letting other people know they're loved by God deeply. But I want to begin just to introduce you guys to this group. I've known these two men for several years, and we've met in many different places and locations, and I want them to hear your own personal pilgrimage to faith briefly. Malcolm?
Gosh. So I had the blessing and good fortune to be born into a Christian household. However, this was a good fortune which I proceeded to squander in my teenage years. So my father was a professor of classics, but also a Methodist local preacher. My mother was a Scots woman from just north of Glasgow, and their church background was Presbyterian, but her great gift to me was poetry. She's a great fund of all the poems that I find myself recalling, and she's still reciting great poetry to me now. She's about to be, God willing, she should be 100 this December. She can't remember what happened 5 minutes ago, but she can recite Shakespeare perfectly. So I had that very goodly heritage, and it was very real to me as a child. But I, like many teenagers, I suppose, and particularly because I was sent away from home to a boarding school in England where I wasn't very happy. It was a very good day school, and in the sort of usual sort of dark and broody and stormy adolescence and crise de foi, I abandoned my faith. And I tried to replace it with a very rigid and rigorous, a strict materialist account of the world. I was kind of taking revenge on all my finer feelings. And in fact, in those days, the Richard Dawkins of those days was B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist. And I was very much trying to give a B.F. Skinner type account of things. The first crack in the concrete, as it were, that I was pouring over the living springs came when I was in my late teens, and suddenly poetry became a huge reality for me after a visit to Keats's house. I came up to Cambridge and read English literature, and there I can say, exactly as with Lewis, to borrow Lewis's very phrase, I can say that I suppose in a way my imagination was baptized before I was. The rest of me just took a little longer to catch up. So exposure to Spencer and Milton, Piers Plowman, and then later George Herbert, John Donne, these things had a profound movement on my imagination. But of course, my intellect and my will also needed to be met. Mm-hmm. The intellect was met very much in reading medieval philosophy, but particularly Boethius. God had to be much more severe with me when it came to the will, but he did come to me at some point in great grace, and I became aware of his presence in an undeniable way, and came to faith and declared that faith in a confirmation service in 1980. Wow. That's remained the key and the light and the guide for me ever since. But the poets showed me the way, and I figured out the rational account of it, as it were, afterwards. But I'm a bit, like Dante gets quite a long way with Virgil before the Beatrice of grace and theology comes in, and I owe a lot to the Virgilian poets of my life.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
I, like Malcolm, had the great blessing to be raised in a Christian family. And I think there was a double blessing in that my father had a pretty dramatic adult conversion in his 20s, whereas my mother had a very stable upbringing in a Christian family herself. So I got both the sort of the continuous life of a Christian growing up from cradle to grave, and my dad more the St. Paul, the Damascus Road sudden turnaround. And I think that gave me both the sort of the stability of faith and the drama, the importance of decision in my upbringing. In my own case, I imitated my mother more than my father in that respect. So I was baptized as an infant, like my two brothers were. We were raised in a very lively evangelical Anglican church, and confirmed at 12 or 13, and went through all the stages of this very lively Christian community, and didn't actually. I'm sorry to be so boring. I never had a rebellious phase. I'm just
give it time.
I'm boringly conformist and conventional. But God takes even someone like me.
He's got a long reach, Michael.
Yes.
He has a long, you both are men of the imagination. You're brilliant academics, teaching at Oxford and Cambridge, but you're also men of imaginative wit and insight and understanding. I would be curious to know how you came to the academic life and how you see the relationship between the imaginative life and the academic life. Rigorous mind and robust imagination. Malcolm?
Gosh. So I always loved language and poetry, and I found I had a natural retention for it and a mind for it. And I loved both having stories read to me and reading stories. I was discovering the C.S. Lewis stories when I was about 7 or 8 was one of the great moments of my life, and I've read them with joy and delight more or less continuously since then. As a child, they've continued to give me pleasure, but that first pleasure they gave me was enormous. So reading for me was one of the great treats of life. And I couldn't believe when I got to school that there was actually a subject called English where you were supposed to read and write about what you read and talk about what... I thought, but that's what I would do if I was given time off, So I always regarded English as like a free period where I got to do, delightful things. So, and I felt like that all the way through. So, when I discovered I could do English A-level, and then the idea that I could go up to Cambridge University for 3 years and do exactly what I would have been doing if I'd been on a desert island with a good library, and call it work, and pretend to a virtue that was not mine, when it was a life entirely of literary and imaginative indulgence. That was a natural path for me. But I think the thing you talk about imagination is really crucial. I became one of the things that happened when I was in my atheist phase was I attempted to have a reductive explanation of everything, including the moments of beauty when you read a poem, or when your heart is stirred by music, or when you fall in love, that this was just unwinding enzymes and the outworking of a selfish gene and so on. And eventually those experiences of imagination became so powerful and so mysterious that I knew almost as a rational statement that a material account, a purely ratiocinative account, would simply not fully account for the depth and the mystery of that experience. So I began to intuit that the imagination might be, in some sense, one of the senses whereby we apprehend truth. That art might be a means of coming at truth. It took me a while to get there. I think for a long time I was in the exact same place as Lewis, where I had a split mind, where I loved my poetry, but I thought it had nothing to do with the final cold calculus of the law of entropy and a dissolving universe. I mean, there's a bit in Surprised by Joy where Lewis says, the two hemispheres of my mind were in sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly everything I loved, I believed to be untrue. Nearly everything I thought to be true, I found cold and repulsive, or words to that effect. So what I needed was a way of bringing the imaginative and the rational faculties together. And of course, the object which finally satisfies and feeds and develops both faculties is the myth that became history, the great story that is also available as reliable historical fact.
It's significant that in the Arthurian torso, Lewis says that the first problem in life is how do you reconcile the head and the heart?
Absolutely.
And then his first book he wrote after he became a Christian, Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. Because just like you said, he felt they...
Yes, that head and heart thing I think is very important. There's a wonderful bit in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria where he's talking about the period in which he could have become atheist. He didn't, but he was reading William Law, actually, and but also some earlier Christian mystics. And he said, the writings of these mystics served to keep alive the heart in the head.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, I've seen you speak at many places. I remember when you had us mesmerized in chapel here at Wheaton College, and the students giving you a standing ovation and so on. You bring these things together. I remember being in Christchurch Meadow a month after you discovered something that was life-changing for you, and you were explaining it to me, and I was just blown away, not only by your mind, but by your imagination. For you, when did the academic and the imaginative life wake up, and how do they connect?
Hard to give it a date. Again, this is something that's been growing with me really since the earliest I can remember. And it's almost entirely due to C.S. Lewis, I think, that he, in his writings, modeled that bridge, that unity himself, the imaginative and the rational, all in service of faith. In my case, my academic interest was not exclusively English. My two topics at school that I was good at were English and RE, religious education. And I remember thinking in my teens, well, which of these two am I going to pursue? And I remember sitting in church one Sunday evening at the end of a service and praying, please, Lord, show me which of these two I should pursue. And the answer came pretty clearly, both. You will not have to choose between the two. Yeah. And so in pursuing C.S. Lewis, I was able to look at both English lit and theology, because of course he combines the two almost everywhere he's working. So when it came time for me to do my PhD, the natural topic was Lewis, because I was really fairly expert in his writings. And then I stumbled across this pattern, as I believe it to be, of the Narnia Chronicles, and that was 15 years ago now. Wow. And that was a kind of gift, I believe, that was put in my lap, and that's really dominated my academic life ever since.
Well, you cover a lot of areas. One of your books out there is on heresies as well. So you look at orthodoxy, you look at imaginative work, as you did with Lewis. Lewis was you mentioned RE too, but Lewis not only brings you then theology and literature, but he also brings religious education. Mm-hmm. He was a great educator, as you guys both are. So the question I have now is, Lewis seemed to be a man who was able to integrate faith and learning. When Malcolm, we were sitting by each other, I think, when they dedicated the stone at Westminster Abbey.
We were, indeed. It was a great day, yeah.
And the stone says on it, in coming to understand anything, no, that's the wrong quote, I'm so sorry. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. This suggests this integration of faith and learning. This institution exists to help students integrate faith and learning. Where is that for you, and how has Lewis benefited you there?
I think this is absolutely essential. First of all, I think it's really important that Lewis was a great scholar and a scholar of great integrity. That when I came myself, having loved the Narnia books and having read and been deeply impressed and influenced by the literary criticism, C.S. Lewis's book, A Preface to Paradise Lost, was life-changing for me in terms of not only bringing Milton alive for me, but showing me how to read poetry at all, and other of Lewis's essays. So I already knew Lewis to be a man of great power of mind, and real integrity and somebody who was, without question, a dedicated servant of the truth, that he would never let anything slipshod go past him. When he talks about the proper scholarship and the service of reason and not ever allowing a convenient half-truth to color your argument because it would be useful if you hadn't thoroughly examined it. I mean, in his poem, which was titled Reason, in fact, he didn't give it a title, which, when he says, set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. He who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear is reason. That integrity in Lewis meant that when I came to read Lewis in books like Miracles or The Problem of Pain or Mere Christianity, making a case for Christianity, I already trusted him as a scholar and loved his intuitions and his imaginative writing. And had I read a book making the case for Christianity by somebody who was not clearly a person of scholarly integrity in other writings, I wouldn't have trusted it. So I think that establishment, as it were, of the scholarly character is important. But the great thing about Lewis, I remember when we did this great day at Westminster that Dr. Ward helped to set up, we were assigned, I was asked, together with Professor Alistair McGrath, there were 2 talks in the afternoon, and the original idea was that I would talk about the imagination and the imaginative apprehension in apologetics for Lewis, and he would talk about reason. I mean, it so happened that I was editing a special edition of, I was guest editing a special edition of Theology, the journal that was, and I had already commissioned Alistair McGrath to write something for that, so we were in conversation. And I wrote to him saying, I'm not sure that we can split up reason and imagination in this. I can certainly talk about his imaginative writings, but even they appeal to reason. And he immediately wrote back to me and said, oh, I feel exactly the same. I think that what's great about Lewis's apologetic writing, his defenses of the faith, and is that every time he makes a point which could have been merely abstract, he illustrates it with a beautiful analogy, just like the one you've quoted. Mm-hmm. He could have said, it would have been quite easy, and I know a lot of Cambridge academics, I'm sorry to say, or Oxford, who would have said...
no, in Oxford.
They would have... you could say, in the Logos considered as in a frame of cosmic Christology, you have not only a hypostasis of the Trinity, but you have an epistemological principle. And that would have been a way of saying, we know things by Christ as well as knowing about Christ. Lewis could have said that. But he said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun rises. I see it and I see everything by it. Mm-hmm. But it was true that one of the great things that Lewis showed me, and that has become, if you're a Christian scholar, it's not the case that you have your Christianity here and your scholarship there. Because Christ is the Logos, in whom and through whom all things were made. There's nothing that you could look at or study or care about in the world that was not breathed into being and loved by Christ. And Christ, we're told in Colossians, is the one in whom all things hold together. And therefore, for a Christian, there's no way, as it were, of course, there is a subject, you can look at the story of Jesus of Nazareth and you can focus on the atonement. But actually, from, I put it in a poem I wrote about Colossians, from spanning galaxies to spinning quarks. Mm-hmm. Everything holds together. So he's not only the creator, but he is also the light that lightens everyone that comes into the world. For a Christian thinker, to think at all is to participate in the mind of Christ. Wow. And that's why you don't do it lightly, wow, but you do it with great joy. I'll tell you one of my favorite quotations, which nobody quotes now because we're not allowed to smoke our pipes as much as we used to, although I do. So one of his great moments, one of his great quotations about joy and delight comes, I think it's in his preface to somebody's translation of Athanasius on the Incarnation, right? Theologically, it doesn't get more hardcore than that. And Lewis says, some people who find difficulty in devotions in church and find they get on their knees and nothing happens, that same person working through a bit of tough theology with a pipe in their teeth and a pencil in their hand, suddenly finds the Spirit sings and joy is overflowing. That's Christian scholarship, when you're moved to sheer overflowing joy by the truth that comes to you in the very act of study.
Yes. Michael.
Can you remind me what the question was?
Well,
Sorry.
the idea of integration of faith and learning is characterized by the memorial plaque that you selected the quote from.
Yes, we had quite a tussle with Westminster Abbey to get that quotation on the stone.
Why is that?
They run all new memorials through a committee, of course, and one person on the committee apparently didn't think it was a good quotation. So they said, maybe we could have half the quotation. Seriously, they did.
Welcome to the Church of England, right? Right.
And I said...
It's just simply the sun has risen?
It was worse than that. It was sort of, there were ellipses. And I said, no, look, it'd be better to have no quotation than to butcher this quotation, which is a beautiful, balanced quotation. Anyway, we pushed back, and eventually this chap on the committee capitulated. But when it came to the day at Westminster Abbey where Alistair McGrath was giving the lecture, he quoted the line, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And yeah, he said, as Malcolm indicated, you could, a lesser writer could have rendered that as Christianity is both evidenced and evidencing. That's the same point, put in much less attractive language.
Right.
But Lewis, being a great poet, seeing seeing the symbolism in the natural world, saw the usefulness of the sun in this respect, and gives you this marvelous, memorable, poetic line.
It's the last line in what essay?
Is theology poetry?
Exactly.
Yeah. Is theology poetry? And in a way, theology is poetry, because all things are poetry. Poetry just means something that is made, and all things have been made. We have been made, and we've been made in the image of a maker. So we ourselves should be creative. That's a Tolkienian.
Tolkien said the same thing in Mythopoeia. He says we make still by the law by which we're made. So just as in scholarship you encounter Christ and the mind of Christ, so in creative writing you do. That when you get to that point of exercising your imagination, you find that part of the image of God in you is your imagination. And I think, I remember talking about imagination and the power of it to embody a truth, which Lewis exercises so well. I can remember when I was working on my book Faith, Hope and Poetry, which was my own attempt to give to write into the secular academic world an account of why I think these things should hold together. So I was considering Shakespeare's great account of what poetry is, and maybe because it was in the context of a book I saw something in it, which I'd known this quotation from Midsummer Night's Dream for years, and I suddenly saw, if you like, this echo of the divine. So yeah, I'm sure you all know this. This is the great account of what poetry is, where we're told. He sets it up by saying, imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. And then he goes on to say, the poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, that's a great account of all imaginative writing and of poetry itself, that there's this thing which you can't quite put your finger on, it's disembodied, it's in the realm of apprehension, and that you make and shape this beautiful thing, which is not, it's a house, it's a habitation. You're inviting the insight to come into the house, and you're inviting the reader to come into the house, and the habitation is a place of meeting. But of course, Shakespeare sets it up with this extraordinary repetition of heaven and earth. So you've got heaven and apprehension and invisible, and you've got earth and visible. And how do you link them? You need a body. You need imagination which apprehends heaven to body forth something. And I was going through this and thinking, what does this remind me of? Oh yeah, it's maker. Maker means poet, poein, creator of the heavens and the earth and of all things visible. And I thought, what is this bodying? And I suddenly grasped that in a quiet and beautiful way, in a play which is set technically BC, because it's in Athens, Shakespeare, in accounting for his own art, is riffing on the prologue to John's Gospel. You think about the beginning of John's Gospel, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was with God in the beginning. It's great theology, but you could go on like that forever, and you can't see a thing, can you? You can't get hold of that. And you're going on with that, and then suddenly you get those words, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, bodied forth. The word love, you know, people use it in all kinds of ways, but it was bodied forth in Jesus. And then it goes on to say, we beheld his glory. And of course, the first question in John to Jesus is, Master, where are you staying? Mm-hmm. You know, ubi habitat, where's your habitation? So I suddenly began to see that we've been made by a God who wanted not only to make a world, but to body forth his meaning forever, for everyone, in a person, so that the meaning could be encountered, not just with the mind, but with the body and the heart. And I think every artist, whether they're Christian or not, is doing that because that's the kind of thing their Father in heaven did.
Richard Weaver, the rhetorician at University of Chicago, who wrote Ideas Have Consequences, and also wrote The Ethics of Rhetoric, said the best arguments are the argument from definition. You can get to the thing. If you go off the rails inferentially, you could go back to the thing and so on. But what do you do if you're going to talk about something infinite, since definition means of the finite? How do you talk about God? Yeah. So the medieval scholastic philosophers and theologians talked about the way of analogy, the use of the imagination to communicate theological truth, but getting back to the idea of this integration of imagination and also the faith integration approach to life. Was there more you wanted to say about this, Michael?
Well, I'm put in mind of Lewis's essay on Christianity and literature, where he's asked to address this question about integrating faith and literature. And in a way, he says there's no such thing as Christian literature any more than there is such a thing as Christian cookery. I mean, the principles by which you prepare a meal are the same whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian. There might be some situations in which a meal could be regarded as immoral if it was excessively luxurious or involved a great deal of animal pain or something. That would be an un-Christian piece of cookery. But the principles of preparation and cooking and serving are the same for everybody. And in a way, that goes for learning, too. The principles of learning are the same whether you're a Christian or non-Christian. You will not fiddle the facts to suit your theory. You will be honest. You will be humble before the data. You will work hard. You will expect high standards of your students. You will mark the papers honestly. You won't have favorites. Those principles are the same whatever, hopefully. And you could take it across the board. Is there such a thing as an integration of Christianity and sport? Is there such a thing as integration of Christianity and, I don't know, spelling reform? to use that example from the Screwtape Letters. If you have religion, Lewis says, it must be cosmic, to come back to Malcolm's point. There will be nothing that escapes, and that there's a danger in the very word religion that it may lead us to suppose there's such a department of life as the non-religious. But of course that's not true, because everything comes under God's fatherhood.
I think that's true, but I think there is a difference. You're absolutely right that the same standards apply, and the same great writing can certainly be done by a person who's not a Christian, and a Christian reading a great writer who is not a Christian can learn things that are true about great writing. But there is this difference, I think, that a thoughtful Christian who is involved in creative arts has a deep spiritual and theological grounding for what they do, and can rejoice and delight in the fact that their little bit of making is done by the gift of their Father and to please him, and that the very principles of it are given by the active life of the Holy Trinity. So Dorothy Sayers, the mind of the maker, I think would exemplify that extremely well. It's not that she's saying you have to be Trinitarian to be a good playwright. She's saying that if you are a good playwright, then by the anonymous grace of the Trinity, certain principles are at work in you which make your playwriting possible. And one of the ways I see actually evangelism and the whole business of sharing the gospel is that we, God in Christ is the anonymous benefactor of billions, and you see it in the gospel all the time. Jesus is helping people and already healing people who don't know who he is. But once he has healed and helped, he wants to know them. So like the woman, I always think a lot of us, a lot of people are like the woman who touches the hem of Christ's garment, and something real happens. He does something for her without her knowing who he is. And she wants to slip away in the crowds. And Jesus stops and says, no, when he sees her face to face. And eventually he gives her this great honorific title. He calls her a daughter of Jerusalem, she who's been excluded because of her issue of blood. And I feel that when I'm talking to other writers, and meeting other poets who don't share my faith, I'm wanting to find a way to tell them that the giver of their gift has a name, and that the framer of the very possibility of knowledge and communication, the meaning behind all meaning, the word within all words, knows them and loves them. Now, they don't have to know his name, and they don't even have to know that he knows and loves them in order to deploy the gifts he has anonymously given them. But what a joy to be able to slip them a secret piece of paper so they can finally know the name of their anonymous benefactor.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Malcolm, you said some things earlier that made me think everywhere we look in a world made by God, it's technically a call to worship. Yeah. If we look at it well, God has exhibited something of his glory. Even in the struggle and the brokenness, we recognize that it's not a permanent thing. It is something that's hopefully going to lead to resurrection, glory, and so on. And
it's in him. I wonder if I could slip a poem in under the radar at this point. Just this sense that Christ is not simply confined. Christ is not simply active within 3 feet of an open Bible when he's been properly invoked, and everybody in the room believes the right thing. I was asked recently by a recording artist called Alana Lewandowski, who was doing a whole album just about Colossians, just a beautiful musical response to Colossians. And I didn't know her, but she wrote to a bunch of poets, of whom I was one. And not to say, have you got a poem for this, but I would like you to, I'm going to divide between you poets a series of verses in Colossians, and I'm recording in 3 weeks. Can I have a poem? And can you read it? It was wonderful chutzpah, and we all did it. We all were meek as lambs, Scott Cairns and Lucy Shaw and myself. We just going, oh yes, okay, fine, I hope I get it in on time. But I was delighted, and I lucked in. So I got this in Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible. It goes on. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things. In him all things hold together. So what came out of that was this, and maybe this undergirds some of this discussion. Everything holds together. Everything. From stars that pierce the dark like living sparks, to secret seeds unfolding every spring. From spanning galaxies to spinning quarks, everything holds together and coheres, unfolding from the center whence it came. And now, the hidden heart of things appears. The firstborn of creation takes a name. And shall I see the one through whom I am? Shall I behold the one for whom I'm made? The light in light, the flame within the flame, icon to Theo, image of my God? He comes, a little child, to bless my sight, that I might come to him for life and light.
The whole concept of the incarnation is so strong in that. The whole concept of the incarnation is so strong in that. And you talk about in him everything holds together. So even Lewis's confusion before he was a Christian, he had reasoned his way through the morass of atheism and its supporting materialism.
Yeah.
Finally came to the place where he was a theist, but felt he couldn't know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare.
Exactly, yeah.
And
yeah.
he's thinking about this the same decade, Luigi Pirandello, the Sicilian playwrights, writing 6 characters in search of an author who can't break out of the play to get to know the author, ends in despair. But a year and a half later, after his late night talk with Tolkien, then he revisits the image, and in him all things hold together, as you said. He says the only way Hamlet and Shakespeare could ever really know each other would be, Michael, take it over.
If Shakespeare walked into the play, wrote himself into the play.
What was the conversation that he had with Tolkien that helped him grasp that?
He had a conversation with Tolkien and a third friend, Dyson, Hugo Dyson, about myths of dying and rising gods, which Lewis had always found very moving and meaningful as he'd grown up. Myths of, he mentions Adonis and Bacchus and Balder, the corn gods. These stories of deities who go down into the underworld and whose death reveals or achieves something back here on earth, like the coming of spring or the coming of the sunrise or the new life in the crops. And he'd found those pagan myths strangely powerful, but obviously he hadn't regarded them in any way as historical. Whereas with Christianity, he'd been focusing not so much on the drama of Christ's life and death, but on the doctrines that you get out of Christianity, doctrines of propitiation and sacrifice and so on and so forth, which he could only interpret in senses, he said, which seemed to him either silly or shocking. They didn't speak to him at a deep level. It was just skimming off the top of his mind. And then Tolkien and Dyson said, you know those pagan myths you liked? Christianity is one of those same stories, except this one really happened. Yeah. This dying and rising God can be dated and located in a particular time and particular place. So respond to it as a story, as a drama of a character going through a sequence of events, which only later is turned into a system of theological thought. And once Lewis thought that Christianity was a story, a true story, that was the great breakthrough for him.
It's interesting that the use of the imagination in this witness to Lewis by Dyson and Tolkien was a means of them sharing the gospel with Lewis also.
Yeah. Lewis is very clear about that in one of his letters, where when he writes to Arthur Greaves and says, I finally become a Christian, he says, my long late night talk with Tolkien and Dyson, had a lot to do with it. I think, that, do you remember I quoted that thing earlier about the 2 hemispheres of my mind were in sharpest contrast? So he's got one part of his mind dealing with fact, but there's no meaning in it. It's just dull, cold fact. And there's another part of his mind responding to myth and story and the sheer beauty of it all, but it's not true, so you can't stake your life on it because it didn't happen. So those 2 hemispheres, you can see it on that walk. It's the more you read the accounts of that walk, the more you can see as they're talking, the 2 halves of Lewis' mind sort of trembling and coming together in and on Christ, who is both fact and it feeds the imagination. And in his poem, which I quoted earlier about Athena, he has a beautiful thing about reason as Athena, and then he has a fabulous thing about Demeter as imagination, and her and he says, tempt not Athene, right? So you don't mess with the facts. But wound not Demeter in her fertile pains, nor rebel against her mother right. And then he asks this question. I thought this might be really late. I thought this might be like 28, 29. But I was talking to Alistair McGrath about this, and he thinks this poem might be as early as 1926. Wow. So you think how long, this is like some years before. So in this poem, Lewis asks this question. He says, oh, who will reconcile in me? Yes. Both maid, reason, and mother, imagination. Who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Who make a concord of the depth and height? Who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then could I wholly say, and not deceive. Then could I wholly say that I believe. And you read that, and you think, oh, come on, Jack. Mm-hmm. Look, can't you see? Look, let's just go through this. Who is it whose ministry is reconciliation? Who is it who reconciles the depth and height? Who is it of whom we say that you may know the length and breadth and height and know the love of God which passes knowledge? Finally, who came into the world through someone who was both a maid and a mother? You know, it's like it's staring him in the face.
Yeah.
And it took him 3 or 4 years. But when Tolkien and Dyson put it that way, suddenly those things came together. But the last thing I'd say about that conversation, if Tolkien and Dyson had G'd themselves up the night before and said, right, we're going to evangelize Lewis good and proper, you know, it's your... If there'd been some kind of human game plan, let's trick him into Christianity with all that myth stuff. Do you know what I mean? It would have been a total disaster. The reason why he heard Tolkien on that and Dyson is that they were already colleagues who knew and loved those stories. And they were all three of them, like Lewis, looking at a thing they loved. Mm-hmm. And so the evangelism was just beautiful and natural because it was from friends that already loved what he loved.
Mm-hmm. So getting shoulder to shoulder with Lewis rather than trying to confront him. Yeah. They're able to describe something out here. He sees it. He already knows something about it. And you see some of that in Lewis's own efforts to share the gospel with other people. He said, most of my books are evangelistic. Well, we could see the apologetic book certainly would be. And then when he writes to Sister Penelope after Out of the Silent Planet comes out, he says, I've discovered any amount of theology can be smuggled into people's minds under the guise of romance. But in what way would he be saying most of my books are evangelistic?
Spud.
Well, most of my books are addressed to those outside, tous exo, the Greek phrase that Jesus uses when he's talking about the parables, that they are hidden from those outside, but they are revealed to the disciples. Mm-hmm. I think because of the holistic truth that we've just been talking about, that there's nothing that escapes Christ's lordship. That's as much evident in Miltonic scholarship and in philology and in apologetics and in fiction and poetry as it is in direct, explicit evangelism. So everything can be turned to evangelistic effect, but it must be done conscientiously. It mustn't be done deliberately in a sort of manipulative kind of fashion.
But deliberate and manipulative are not necessarily
exactly.
No, they're not. No.
Yeah. So I know he said one time, we don't need more books by Christians about Christianity. We need more books by Christians about other subjects with their Christianity latent. Chesterton said, I didn't believe in Christianity because one or two things proved it. I believed in it because everything seemed to suggest its proof. There was this integration that came through once again. There was one thing he said, sometimes fairy stories say best what needs to be said, and sometimes there's a need for a story to get past watchful dragons. What did Lewis mean by that? And what do you think that can do for us if we want to learn from him?
Well, I think was it in his On 3 Ways of Writing for Children that he said that watchful dragons passage. I think there are two things there actually going on in that. First of all, I think he was talking about the watchful dragons of our own culture, that we, the dominant culture, the spirit of the age, sets up parameters of what we're allowed to believe is the case. What the great sociologist Peter Berger called plausibility structures, that we kind of inhabit them. So in a secularist and reductive age, there's a kind of filtering mechanism going on where we just simply refuse or dismiss or tune out anything that speaks of the divine. And he felt that particularly in secularist education and secularist schooling, there were people who were effectively trying to stop children from knowing these, that there was a resistance to specifically religious discourse, particularly from a sort of secularist thing. We're saying, well, that's done with that. You know, religion will wither on the vine. We're not going to give our kids these superstitions. They're all going to grow up into the brave new world of clean scientific rationalism. So I think there were watchful dragons there. But I think there's a deeper sense that all of us, the bit of us, the unredeemed, still selfish bit of us that just wants to be left alone, to be autonomous, to be a self-ruler, and not to be interfered with. Lewis felt that very strongly, you know, not to be interfered with by anybody. The bit of us that wants to keep its habits and keep its secular gains and resist the divine because the divine might disturb. That sets up its own watchful dragons as well. And we can resist messages that are really life-transforming for us, and we can pretend we haven't heard them or think of specious reasons why we shouldn't hear them, and we do all that. And then God comes in from a completely different angle. And Lewis, looking back on the experience of reading George MacDonald on the railway train, that was exactly what happened to him. He didn't deserve it. He was positively resisting it. He had his new outfit of atheism, and he would have resisted great and beautiful rational argument about Christianity, even by greats like Augustine. He would have resisted it because of the label. So God just gives him a second-hand book from a book barrow on a railway station in a fairy story, and then suddenly the watchful dragons. And I do think we have to be aware sometimes of our own personal watchful dragons.
Yeah, I think actually I hadn't thought this thought until this very moment, but Malcolm was talking about different kinds of watchful dragon, and it occurs to me that, you know, Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, talks about the disastrous discovery that we exist, or that self-consciousness can be terribly inhibiting and debilitating, that rather than having a religious experience, this is now that hideous strength, you watch yourself having a religious experience, or you say to yourself, oh, I've just had a religious experience, how better now I will be able to understand the 17th century poets. And immediately your mind is taken off God onto yourself in your relationship with God. And that's disastrous.
Yeah.
So those watchful dragons that are sneaking up on us from every side, trying to get our attention off the real thing, the object of final worship, the ultimate reality, well, that's the key thing from which we live and to which we live. Those watchful dragons also need to be stolen past by the author as she writes, with your mind fixed on what you really are trying to do and say for God's glory.
So he talks about stealing past those watchful dragons too. So he wrote in a preface to Paradise Lost, a book you've already mentioned, Malcolm, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind.
Yeah.
So if I do something wrong and don't have my heart broken by this revelation, self-revelation that I really am capable of hurting people, hurting myself, then I will begin to rationalize that behavior, acrasia, like the character in Spencer's Fairy Queen.
Yeah.
Acrasia sets in. And how do you then steal past those watchful dragons where all the defenses are up?
Yeah.
And you think about Nathan, who's told, go tell David he's in trouble. Or Jesus using parables for those who have eyes but cannot see and ears but that do not hear. How do you steal past? And Jesus is telling stories. Go ahead, you were going to say something more about it. Go ahead.
Oh, well, just to come back to the parables, yeah, it's interesting that Jesus, A, teaches through narrative and story and character, but B, teaches through narrative, story and character things which are not immediately obvious. In other words, he's hiding the message. Why do that? Why not make your message clear? It's because he's wanting to elicit a free response. He's wanting his hearers to seek him out. In other words, he's wanting a response of love, not a response of submission. Because he could have made it clear. He could have overwhelmed his audience with utterly inescapable points and messages, but that's not a relationship of love. So that, I think, is one other reason why Jesus teaches in parables. You've got to want it. You've got to seek it out, and then you will get the loving relationship going.
There is something about the word revelation. It means to reveal.
Yeah.
Even when God displays his glory, Habakkuk 3 says that there was also the hiding of his power in the display of his power. He doesn't show the extent of his omnipotence.
But the reveiling is also an invitation to an unveiling.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying, you know, keep looking through this to me. You know, that sense, I think one of the most moving things for me, certainly when I was in this period where I was rescued from completely reductive atheism by the sheer beauty of poetry. But in that beauty, I always felt a beckoning and a calling. Crystal was, and David were interviewing me for a podcast today, and I was trying to talk about what it was about poetry itself, imaginative poetry, that had this extra feature, this something, almost more of this world. And I recollected the first time I read Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which is not an explicitly religious poem at all. But he's drawn out into the garden and he's going through the dark. And then he's trying to think about all the different generations of the world that heard this same song of the nightingale, right? And suddenly, out of nowhere, and Keats was not a believing Christian, out of nowhere comes the biblical image of Ruth standing in tears. When Ruth, sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn. You know, this deep yearning. And then suddenly he says, that same nightingale that Ruth heard, this is not a logical leap now, this is an imaginative segue, he says, such hath had charmed ope, magic casements opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. So right at the back of the poem is suddenly this yearning, these windows opening, and perilous seas. And I was unspeakably moved by that. I had what Jack, I realized later, you know, I had joy. And I still have joy in that. That at the back of this thing, which was not apparently about Jesus or anything, there was this yearning invitation to get through the windows. And I think, you know, it made me think, in a weird way, of the door of the wardrobe, and the sense that this little box that you thought you knew could suddenly open out onto an entire new world. And that experience, when you have that experience, like opening a tiny little door and it turns out to be a huge cathedral, then I really think God is at work. When I'm working with students, and they're, you know, you get all kinds of odd cults and sects, you know, preying on students in universities, and they have to make their own choice. But I often say, when you go through the door they want you to open, does the world look bigger or smaller? Does it look larger? Are there greater possibilities for who you are, or lesser ones? Mm-hmm. And that seems to be a mark of the authenticity of the gospel, is that you're invited into this beautiful largesse and generosity, you know, the pleroma, the overflowingness of God.
I wonder, Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors in that way, doesn't he? Yeah. That somehow when you read him, he's opening up windows on the world. Absolutely. And in every one of those windows, in some senses, there's a call, an imperious call, ultimately to God and to the display of his glory. Would you say something more about that, Michael?
Yeah, that comes back to your earlier question about how come all his books, or nearly all his books, can he describe as evangelistic? Mm-hmm. Because, you know, something as dry as semantic change, you know, the transformations words go through in their meanings in Lewis's book, Studies in Words. Something as, you know, dry and desiccated seeming as that can itself be a window.
It's been my contention that if a person has a faith-integrated liberal arts education, like hopefully you're picking up here at Wheaton College, you will find natural segues to the gospel with everybody, and you'll find points of connection with anybody, because everybody's so interesting and there's so many things going on in their minds and hearts. But not everybody has an academic background. Does that mean then you can't share Christ the way Lewis might share Christ? And I was talking with Malcolm about this earlier today, and he said, oh, that reminded me of a song.
Oh, did it? Right. Okay. That's a segue, isn't it? No, I think I think we were talking about how clever people can manipulate words. And they can make one word mean one thing and another word mean another, or they can make the same word mean something different next time they meet you. And that the great joy of the gospel is that the word has been made flesh. And it's made flesh in people's actual lives. And you don't have to be a huge manipulator of words or a man with a big library in order to meet the word made flesh. I think that was the conversation. I haven't played this song for a long time, but I could give it a go.
I think we want you to play it, and then when he's done, we'll open it up for question and answer if you have something you'd like to ask either Michael or Malcolm. Actually, if you want, maybe we could get Michael to play a song afterwards.
Actually, Michael has a very good voice. Just saying.
I didn't hear it.
So this is in a kind of bluesy mode, and this is called The Word Made Flesh. And it's just about how people manipulate words, but particularly, you know, the words. So there are three words, three pretty big words that could be abused, but need to be bodied forth, to wit, love, truth, and God. So let's see if I can remember it. Well, people use a word like love. They might be right or wrong. They can make love sound like it's falling apart. They could make love sound so strong. But love just holds out aching arms and offers a brand new start. Everybody tears at the clothes he wears. Nobody gets close to his heart. But there's a world of difference between what we say and what we do. So you won't ever be touched by love till the word is made flesh for you. And people take a word like truth, they twist it their own way. They want you to believe that what was true last week could never be true today. And truth, she stands in the marketplace where they try to take her apart. Everybody tears at the clothes she wears. Nobody gets close to her heart. And people take a word like God, they make it up as they go along, 'cause they want you under their dominion and they want you to sing their song. And God, he looks in through the window, but they're too busy preaching to see. He says, come out and walk with the word made flesh. Come outside, follow me. Would you let me make a difference to everything you say and do? Let me touch you with my wounded hands. I'll be the word made flesh for you. Because the word was born from a womb for us. The truth was nailed to a tree. The love of God broke free from the grave, but I guess we just didn't see. And he was never bound down in a big black book, never hidden in a holy shrine. He was born to be broken in the bread of your life and poured out in the wine. He was born to be broken in the bread of your life and poured out in the wine.
You mentioned truth in the You mentioned truth in the song. You mentioned it earlier, and how Lewis sort of bowed to the constraints of truth. And in his book, Michael Ashelman's book, C.S. Lewis and the Case Against Scientism, I don't know if this is original with Ashelman or if he was quoting Malcolm Muggeridge, but he said of C.S. Lewis, he bowed to the constraint of truth and thus climbed its ladder.
Yeah.
It's a great insight. If you have questions, there's microphones on either side, and we'll just start here on the left, and we'll move to the right, back and forth, and then at 8:30, we'll bring it to a close by turning it back to Crystal. Yes, Jeff Fraser. This man is the strongest man I know. I saw him pick up a house one time.
That was the risk I ran standing up. I was, you referenced the Addison's Walk with Lewis and Tolkien and Dyson. As I recall it, I don't know if it was Tolkien or Dyson that said myth, maybe it's Lewis recalling it, saying that the Christ myth is like all other myths, working on us in the same way, with one tremendous difference, that it actually happened. Michael, you were referring to that. I've wondered for years, what do they mean when they say working on us? I'd love to hear your insights on what it means that myths work on us and in what way they do.
I think working on us might sound quite sinister, but I don't think it's meant to be. I think it's that great essential of Christianity, which is that what has been done for us by Christ on the cross, it is definitely done for us, but it has to be done in us. So there has to be a point where that profound death and resurrection, that atonement, has to happen in here as well. We're baptized into Christ, and he comes into us. So I think what had already happened with Lewis was that when he read about the death of Balder the Beautiful, he says that when he heard the cry, Balder the Beautiful is dead, he felt this immense joy. And that story in which Balder, who is the god of light, is killed by his own brother, the blind Hodder, because Loki has put a poison dart in his, and how when Balder dies, the whole of creation weeps except for one, and that there's one missing weep, and that if only the whole of creation weeps, Balder will rise again, and that Odin. There's so much in that is trembling towards now the truth in Christ. Now I think Lewis had internalized those myths, but he never had internalized the Jesus story. That was just stuff out there in the gospel. So he needed, as it were, just as in the Balder story, the whole point is that all creation weeps. And in fact, Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, mentions the Anglo-Saxon poem, The Dream of the Rood. And in that Dream of the Rood poem, which is a beautiful account of the death of Christ on the cross, spoken by the cross itself, the cross says in Anglo-Saxon, way up Aelia all creation wept. And that all creation, so, it makes the link, therefore, between Balder and Christ. But all creation is every one of you. There's a sense in which the fullness of Christ's atonement has to be worked with every single person. Every single person weeping at the foot of the cross and weeping in the garden of resurrection. Mary Magdalene receives the word of the resurrection and becomes an apostle to the apostles because she stays weeping. And so, do you have that, when you read a great story, a great moment in The Lord of the Rings, or even for me, the Narnia books, you actually cry. There's certain moments you cannot help it. You cry. I still cry, at certain moments in those stories. That is a myth working in you rather than just on you. And that has to happen in your walk with Christ, I think.
Michael, did you want to respond to that?
Working on us in the same way as these pagan stories, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. So in what way does Christianity work on us in the same fashion as a pagan myth? I think Lewis means in the way of engaging our human sympathies, in engaging our imaginations, that we invest ourselves in the characters. We suffer with them. We rejoice with them as they die and they rise. To that extent, the story of Christ is the same as any story of a dying or rising God. But with this tremendous difference that it really happened. That this is not just in the realm of fiction, it's also in the realm of history. It has walked off the stage into real life. So it's immeasurably more important.
If I can suggest something too, if it's okay, will you allow me? He writes in Experiment in Criticism that the mark of the unliterary person is that they read a book only once. Nobody should beat themselves up over this, because you could go to the Wade Center, the greatest asset to Lewis studies in the world, right here on our campus, and if you haven't visited it, then shame on you. But you can go there, and they have his copy of Don Juan by Lord Byron, and you could go to the back cover, and right at the back, he writes the date he finished it, and right underneath it, he writes, "Never again." Now, he refers to that in Surprised by Joy, so you could be reading the book and then go to the Wade Center and see the fact. But the bottom line is, what did he mean? The mark of the unliterary is they read a book only once, or the mark of the literary is that they read some books more than once. And I think in part, it's because every time we go to the book, like every time we reread the myth, we see layers.
Yeah.
We go down deeper, and it goes down deeper in us. So you can know a truth. There's an objective reality that supports your truth claim. But you must hold it with an open hand, with the open hand of humility, because that truth can still be plumbed more deeply. It has applications to questions you haven't even begun to ask. And consequently, it could also be understood in some sort of coherent relation with other truths. It's glorious. It's magnificent. It's working itself on us. And it's opening up our world. And then when we encounter God in that world, it awakens wonder and awe, and hopefully at our best worship as well.
I mean, that's another thing, that the arts do particularly, I think, that awakening and opening. There's a great bit in Coleridge's Biographia Literaria where he's saying what he and Wordsworth thought they were up to when they were writing the lyrical ballads. And most people, I mean, you'll get this in the secular account of the world. People will have this big subjective-objective split. And they say, oh, the arts and beauty and all that touchy-feely stuff, that's just about your inner little private subjective thing, what Lewis called the poison of subjectivism. When you go to the great masters of those arts, they don't say, oh, I'm hoping to make your little inner psyche feel better while you ignore the grim reality of the world. Well, they don't say that. So this is what Coleridge says they wanted to do with their poetry, right? I'm quoting directly. To awaken the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom, like taking it all for granted. And then here's what he says: to remove the film of familiarity which our selfishness and solicitude has cast over the world. The world has a freshness and a glory which is never exhausted, but for which, and again I'm quoting him, quoting the Bible, Coleridge says, we have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. And it's my conviction that as soon as we remove the film of familiarity and we awake the mind's attention, then one of the things that will come shining through is actually the glory of God. And we'll be drawn to it.
Any other questions? Yeah, we've got one here. Your guy's former student.
Yeah, he's a former student of mine, this guy.
This is your chance to get even with them if they were hard on you in tutorials.
You don't want to mess with these guys. Sometimes we're too close to see things, and I'm curious if you guys have any insights about the difference between the watchful dragons in the U.S. and in England. Lewis is an interesting phenomenon, but I'm also curious about your contemporary observations.
You have to be very careful commenting on like other people's watchful dragons. Like, it may be a dragon, but it's my dragon, So I notice, just thinking about universities for a moment, which is the world I know, that there's obviously, as I see it, a kind of division between secular universities and those liberal arts universities that might have a Christian foundation. And that therefore that there's a hived off or separated sort of area of Christian learning which hopes to keep a certain kind of Christian culture alive. And that is laudable, but it also means that in the big secular universities, they become more and more secular. People who've got the Christian insights find that the atmosphere so hostile in some of those departments that they'd rather work in a place that was more congenial. So do you see what I mean? The divide is deepened. There's less of a common turn and a common language. And then there comes the presumption on the part of the kind of great pundits in the secular universities that anything that already has the label Christian of it, that presumes a certain kind of naive ignorance or a refusal to face the facts. So they then dismiss altogether claims which they ought to take seriously because they've already decided that that entire label is irrelevant. So I think there's a split off. Now, one of the great things that still survives, in English universities is that, although of course our main departments are as secular as any others, and of course people can be sneering about the faith, and they can be among what Schleiermacher called the cultivated despisers of religion. But at least in Oxford and Cambridge, colleges which were originally religious foundations, as many of your secular universities were originally religious foundations, but college still retain chapels and chaplains and deans. And the Church of England has had a long tradition when somebody happens to come up with a vocation to priesthood who has an academic vocation as well and who has some integrity as a scholar, they send them, as it were, or strongly encourage them to be chaplains or deans in Oxford and Cambridge. So, you end up with somebody like Rowan Williams, involved in one of the colleges, or, great theologians become deans and chaplains. And the thing is, if you happen to have Rowan Williams sitting on the high table with you and all the fellows are talking together, it's a little bit more difficult to say Christianity is for dummies in the presence of Rowan Williams, because, he may have one or two counter-arguments to that. So there's been a strong tradition of the church placing intelligent persons of faith right there in the midst of, as kind of leaven in the lump, in the midst of a more secular thing. It's not a comfortable position to be in, but it's an important one. And I mean, even back in Lewis's day, I think part of Lewis's failure to get a professorship in Oxford and the way he was marched was to do with an Oxford that was trying to secularize itself, being embarrassed by such a thoroughgoing Christian. But there is a meeting place. And I fear in America that there are fewer and fewer natural meeting places where the serious conversation can be had, which makes both sides uncomfortable, but which needs to be had. I may be wrong there.
That's very, very good. I'll give you something that might be heartening. It was in the early 1980s on this campus where one of the people who really championed the idea of faith and learning was a man named Arthur Holmes. He was a philosopher here on our campus. Of course, he was from England, so you guys could claim him. But he, with Bill Alston, Alvin Plantinga, and so on. In the early 80s, maybe some of you were at the meeting, I remember it very clearly. They said the American Philosophical Association, where all philosophers who are credible in different universities have to read their academic papers if they want promotion and so on. They said, what if we start a subgroup called the Christian Philosophers? And they started it. And now it is the largest subgroup in the American Philosophical Association. So if some philosopher reads a paper and tries to trash Christians, they've got a formidable group of people they need to be prepared to account to. Yeah. And it's one of these kinds of things.
Of course, they're entitled to crash Christians.
And I think to myself, sociologists should do this. Literary people should do this, historians should do this, biologists should do this, physicists. And the Christian universities, if they're getting together and setting these sorts of things up, they can give this sort of, most of my books are evangelistic. We don't need more books by Christians about Christianity, but more books on other subjects with their Christianity latent. It could be transformative evangelistically to a culture because it brings credit to the faith.
To answer Graham's question, I'm put in mind of that place where Lewis talks about mandatory chapel attendance at, I think, Oxford and Cambridge colleges. It used to be required that the students attended chapel. And when it was made voluntary, chapel attendance dropped off precipitously. And Lewis says, perhaps rather surprisingly, that's not necessarily a wholly bad thing, because it now means that those who are attending want to be there. And there's much less hypocrisy going on, and much less, enforced behavior. Now, I mention that because comparing America and the United Kingdom, I think most observers would say the United Kingdom is more secularized, but I'm not sure that's necessarily absolutely a bad thing. I mean, of course, there are many bad things about it, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying it's not simply a bad story, because now that Christianity is less sort of socially respectable, less socially required than it was, those who actually practice their faith are doing it for the right reasons, because they really believe, not because they want to be respectable. So insofar as Christianity in America is still sort of socially respectable, and indeed, in some respects, politically required, you are actually setting yourself up for certain problems, namely hypocrisy, which is worth thinking about.
I'm going to push back a little bit as an American. I still think there's a vast number of people for whom their faith is very much central to their
Of
lives.
course, absolutely. I'm not saying a word against that.
I was actually absolutely shocked. I went to my 50th high school reunion this last weekend. I couldn't believe the number of people in my class, very secular school, who came to real faith over the last 50 years, and hearing their stories and so on, and how easily it percolated. Mm-hmm. So somehow they were in a place where they could hear the gospel message at some level.
No, please don't get me wrong. This is not I mean, in all things being equal, it's probably better to have the problems of hypocrisy than the problems of faithlessness. I'm not saying one nation is better than the other. I'm just saying each has its own associated difficulties.
But the thing about making chapel, when they dropped compulsory chapel attendance, I agree with Lewis that actually that was an improvement. So, people are coming because they want to. But they didn't raise the chapels to the ground and sack all the deans and chaplains, which they could have done. And that's the point I was making, is that there's a need for faithful Christian witness in places where the majority of people are not Christian at all, where the presuppositions and even the very turns of phrase are inimical sometimes to Christianity. That to have a Christian there who is, as it were, a living sed contra, as Aquinas would say, on the other hand, who offers at least a reply to the gesture of contempt.
Mm-hmm. This again gives a strong support for the Lewisian concept, more books by Christians on other subjects with their Christianity latent, so that it gives an academically rigorous, heartfelt respect.
A great example in England would be Sir John Polkinghorne. So Sir John Polkinghorne, Fellow of the Royal Society, really distinguished cosmologist, President of Queen's College, Cambridge, is an Anglican priest and writes great books on modern cosmology and the gospel. And I'm sure there's lots of other fellows of the Royal Society who think, it's a bit embarrassing, these gospel books, but actually, he's Sir John Polkinghorne, and he is so much a master in their world that they can't dismiss him. And he therefore, I think, must give a lot of people in that world pause for thought. Mm-hmm. And just to do that is something.
If there are no more questions, then we'll turn it back over to Crystal Downing. And thank you very much wasn't it a fun evening? I hope you enjoyed it.
Our panel is going to make its way to the foyer, where they are going to set up for book signing. We are making their books available to you at discounted rates. So this would be a great chance for you to buy a book, get their signatures. And I also want to invite you to join us again tomorrow night, where Dr. Guite and Dr. Ward will be giving a presentation in the Baki Auditorium at the Wade Center, where they will be talking about the imaginative conceptions of heaven in C.S. Lewis and a writer he very much admired, Dante, and how their creativity helps us think not only about God in heaven, but also God among us here. So please join us tomorrow night at 7. Also, tomorrow, as part of the program tomorrow night, we have an opportunity to hear David Fuller, who made possible the Muriel Fuller Endowment for Imagination and the Arts, which brought Doctors Ward and Guite here with us. And I just want you, David, could you stand so we could thank you for making this possible? He will be explaining tomorrow night who Muriel Fuller is and why she is important. So I want you now not only to take advantage of the book signing, but there is a reception outside that has been made possible by Martha's Table, which is a fund in honor of Martha Kilby, who was the wife of Clyde Kilby, who is responsible for founding the Wade Center. She was a support of Dr. Kilby in myriad ways, but especially through the gift of hospitality. Also outside, you will look for piles of cards where we're providing you with a discount to feed your imagination in a ballet that is being performed in Chicago in October that was inspired by C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. So look for those cards and their discount code. Please enjoy our reception and the book signing. Thank you for coming.